Lab this week, we'll have a quiz. I'll set them up, set the questions up in the back. So, prepare for it. We're going to see if we finish up nematodes this week and get to the canthocephalans, hopefully. The canthocephalan lecture, I know, is only about a day, maybe a little bit more than a day. So still kind of thinking next week we'll have our exam, probably on Friday. As far as practical goes, we may, so I'm not sure if we'll do the practical next week. We'll see how this week goes, and then we'll make an announcement on Friday. And again, with the practical, it would be live all week. So then you can come in and use Monday and Wednesday as kind of review before you take it. All right. Parasite in the news. March 20th. Ivermectin is safe and well tolerated in young children. What is ivermectin? It's a parasitic drug. Bill Campbell received the Nobel Prize for it a few years back. So actually discovered ivermectin, but ivermectin is a isomer of it. Another derivative. Functions in much the same way. Used throughout the world. You can probably go to Tractor Supply and pick up some ivermectin for horses, for cattle. No problem. Might need a prescription, or they might not sell to you. Demonstrates you actually have that stuff, but the concern is that there's a lack of data regarding the safety of this in kids 15 kilograms or less. How big is that? About 30 pounds. Who weighs 30 pounds? Yeah, I mean, yeah. Super. You talk to 3-year-olds, maybe? Some 4-year-olds. Possibly, depending on their size, but it was never recommended because if they don't have safety studies, they say don't do it because you get sued. This study it's a review article, I should say, meta-analysis. They went and searched the literature for all reports and what has happened. Parasitic diseases, hopefully you're starting to see that some of these are pretty bad, all right? And we deal with them as humans, all right? And we've got treatments for humans. And it's one of these things where we've been, throughout our history now, we're trying to eradicate this stuff. One of the ways in which they've tried to do this is to go in and do these mass drug treatments. Basically go into an entire village and administer the anti-parasitic drugs to everyone. All right, so they have some of that information out there, and where people have reported on that, they might not have reported on the children, their sizes, but those papers that did, they really weren't reporting a whole lot of negative effects. The paper's arguing that based on just what we're seeing in these mass drug trials, we're not seeing these little kids suffering any more significant side effects than anybody else. Now you might ask, well, why even bother with it? Well, some of the other drugs that have been tested in the kids show more significant side effects, or they're not as effective against the parasites. And the ones that we're interested in, and these are ones that are pretty common, onchocerciasis and lymphatic filariasis. These are tissue-dwelling nematodes that we'll talk about. And will likely see, hopefully you see, that these are pretty bad to have. Cause some pretty significant pathology. So something popped up in the news. Paper gives a link. It's actually available if you're interested. So you can kind of read through what they found, how they did their survey, their search. And again, all of the treatments, you can look at scabies treatment, trichuriasis treatment, strongyloidiasis treatment, cutaneous larval migraines treatment, crusted scabies, myiasis, theriasis, parasitic diseases of unknown origin, and just all of these. So if you're interested, check it out. All right, we left off here, I believe. Strongyloides. Yeah, we'll hear about strongyloides this week. So we left off with hookworm. Hookworm needs these moist environments, these warm environments to thrive, and we see most of these infections in these types of areas. Now, as we said, we left off with pathology. Right, there's 3 phases, and it's linked to the migration in the host tissue. So, just a quick review, right? How does the human become infected with hookworm?
Just contact the skin.
Okay, what contacts them? What did doubt say? J3. Yep, J3. Contact skin penetrates, burrows into the skin, then what happens? Where does it go? Okay, how does it get there? Yeah, circulatory system goes to the heart, then the lungs, bursts out, right, in the alveoli and then glottis, or then they move up through ciliary reaction to the glottis, you cough and swallow, feel a little something in the back of your throat, feel some fun, swallow it, gets down in your stomach, small intestine, then it grows, molts to the J4, becomes the adult. Right, so that pathology, where we are in the body, can lead to some pathology. So first is the cutaneous phase. That is a phase when our J3 initially penetrates into the skin. Now, little damage is actually done to the skin or the hair follicles, depending on where they go. Right? In our hookworms, they typically try to go between the cells, which will cause little damage to the cells themselves. All right? And because of that, you don't see significant reactions. Now, it is possible that you get a minor inflammatory response. Right? That inflammatory response could be due to the cuticle that gets shed, or maybe a waste product. But typically, again, it's asymptomatic until these things penetrate into the blood or lymphatic vessels. That's when you might see some slight swelling, if there is. The most likely symptom of this cutaneous phase is what's called ground itch. Ground itch isn't technically caused by the worm itself. It's actually by bacteria that came along with the worm. So it's bacteria that's attached to the cuticle, gets into the skin. Now you get this inflammatory response against the bacteria. Now, this bacteria is pyogenic bacteria because it's the pus forming. All right, you're going to get these slightly raised, flat-topped, very itchy swellings. All right, as your body reacts to it, it's comparable to hives. You can say it's going to be kind of itchy. All right, that is this urticarial reaction. That's basically what we're describing. Okay. Not technically the worm, but it's a bacteria that came in on the worm. All right. So you need the content. I got this picture. I linked it. I remember when it came out. That's the kid. He actually got hookworm from being buried in the sand, or at least that's the suggestion. So that was in the BuzzFeed article. This is when he got it, possibly. Could have been any other time that he was on the wet beach or whatever, but. What's that?
So that's what we're going
Yep,
with.
yeah. And I should tell you, probably isn't the human hookworm. So we'll come back to this. All right, so cutaneous phase, that's the first part. Pretty much asymptomatic. Pulmonary phase is when you start seeing some pathology. All right, this is the timing of this phase corresponds to when the worms are getting into the lungs. Because every place where they break out of those capillaries into the lungs is a site of a slight hemorrhage. Slight blood that gets into the lung. All right, now, individually, that's very, very minor. You wouldn't respond to it. But if you end up getting nailed by 100 worms And those 100 worms all emerge into the lungs all about the same time. It's not just one drop that appears, it's 100 drops of blood that appear. Now we have significant type of inflammation that's going to occur inside of the lungs. All right, so if you have a heavy infection, you're going to get this inflammation. You're going to get possible some pneumonia in the lungs. So you'll have your fluid buildup from the inflammatory response. You could have potential for bacterial infections developing and all this stuff. This will be similar to something that we'll see with Ascaris. But fortunately, with hookworms, it's a little, it's not entirely common to get these big, heavy infections. Normally, it's going to be a few worms that come through at a time. All right, that's why we say the phase is usually asymptomatic, because it's usually only a few worms coming through. As you get into like a minor to moderate infection, instead of developing like the severe inflammation, which you would typically experience as a dry cough or a sore throat. And some of that is just the worms kind of moving up, irritating the lining of the trachea and the glottis. You kind of just have this excess nose running and start getting that scratchy sore throat and stuff. Ready?
No.
So far, cutaneous phase and the pulmonary phase, pretty minor for hookworms. It's the intestinal phase that really matters for these guys. This is the major one. Now we're dealing with the adult. Ready? All right. So the pathology associated with hookworm infection is caused by two different things. Mechanical damage caused by the adults and the associated blood loss that's associated with that. So remember that our hookworms have that sclerotized buccal capsule. They're going to be cutting the intestines, they're going to be feeding on the epithelial tissue, they're going to be feeding on the blood of the host. That's our mechanical damage. All right? That's our mechanical damage. As they move, they're not going to attach and stay in one place. They're going to move. So they're going to, their movement and attachment and so forth is causing multiple places where they are cutting to feed on the intestine. All right, so again, it's not just one isolated spot. It's going to start to expand, and usually it's in the anterior third of the small intestine. That's where most of our damage is going to be. Now, if we're causing this damage, you're exposing the host to secondary infection that can develop. All right, so you get it. You go to the doctor. They may say, oh, you've got a bacterial infection. Let's get the antibiotics. May solve some of the issue, but you still have to deal with continuous damage, continuous possibility of secondary infection. Blood loss is the other component of it. All right, and the effect of the blood loss depends on the species of worm that we're dealing with. Right? And that species of worm basically has different nutritional requirements. So Necator americanus, each worm is going to consume about 0.03 milliliters per day. Ancylostima duodenale, each worm is consuming 0.26 mils per day. So Ancylostima is going to cause a lot more damage than Necator. Or another way you can think about it is you need many more Necator to equal the blood loss caused by Ancylostima. Now, what types of symptoms are associated with this? The primary one is iron deficiency anemia. We talked about anemia, right? We said anemia is decreased hemoglobin content, decreased red blood cell count, right? Iron deficiency can lead to that. What was the other type of anemia that we learned? It is pernicious anemia. What was caused by that? Or what was the cause of that? Vitamin C? Vitamin D? Vitamin E? Vitamin D? Said B, which one? Vitamin B12. Vitamin B12. What parasite caused that? leukemia doesn't cause it. Not enough. That doesn't lead to pernicious anemia. What other tapeworm? You're in the right group. Tapeworm. What was the first one we learned about? Goes in fish. Humans, bears, citrus mammals.
Piloting.
Dipylidium?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's dogs. Please. This one has a Bothria instead of acetabular sclerosis. Diphilobacter. Good review for the final exam. 8 weeks, right?
It starts to.
All right, so we get anemia, but in this case it's iron deficiency anemia. And it's kind of significant because our body will reabsorb the iron. The iron isn't going to be lost to the worm. The worm's going to feed, it's going to release the iron. Our body will absorb up to 40%, but we still exhibit this iron deficiency because we are losing so much blood. Again, species specific. The other thing is that we end up having a decrease in blood proteins. So we're losing proteins in the blood. Our body is trying to make it up, to remake it, so we're consuming a lot of protein. That's good?
Do you,
All right.
Just out of curiosity, like depending on like the worm, but do you know how quickly humans like after they give blood, how quickly they are able to essentially resupply their own blood, for lack of a better term?
Did they say 3 months? Actual blood cell?
Yeah, I was just curious about like the difference between like how
I
quickly.
want to say 3 months, but I don't know. I think you donate blood, and you can donate every 8 weeks.
Depends on the type of donation.
Yeah, so and how valuable your blood is. So platelets, I know platelets. It's going to be individuals. They've had studies where they've measured your platelet counts. You donate, and then they measure it the next day, and it's like your platelet counts didn't drop at all. I think probably same thing with blood, just spleen can store some. But I know it takes a while for blood to for the blood cells to mature. All right, so that's the causes. What are the symptoms? Symptoms ultimately depend on how many worms you have, and then also on the species of worm. Because again, different species have different blood requirement. All right, so our moderate infection typically would exhibit slight to moderate abdominal pain, intestinal pain. Right? Usually have a loss of normal appetite, you're just not feeling that good. But then you might have this desire to eat soil, geophagy. And that's linked to that iron anemia. Your body's craving this iron, and for some reason we've known we can eat dirt to get it. The heavy infections is where it's really kind of bad. Because you're losing the blood, the body's trying to make these blood cells again. You end up getting a severe protein deficiency. Right? Severe protein deficiency. And with that protein deficiency, now you start to exhibit dry hair and dry skin. You can get swelling. You can get pot belly in children's. Kids stand there and their bellies, extended out. Protein deficiency can lead to delayed puberty and mental dullness in kids. So, you've got a kid that's 22, 23 years old, but it looks like they're 12 or 13. All right, that can happen. You can have someone that kind of develops slowly. Cognitive development is slow, all because of this protein deficiency that they have. In some of the most extreme cases, your body is just put under so much stress, and your body's just constantly fighting this, that you could generate some heart failure and death. Basically, your body just basically says, "Hey, I've had enough." I always end up making a joke. How many of you have seen Deliverance? Older movie. Yeah. As we progressed, fewer and fewer have even heard of that movie. That the premise is that 3 friends are down in Georgia to go on a canoe trip. They're canoeing this river that's going to be dammed up to create a reservoir for the last time. They run into some hillbillies. You run into some backwoods people. And early part of the movie, you see a kid that looks like they exhibit this delayed puberty and this mental dullness, but absolutely plays the banjo. He plays the dueling banjos. Yeah. You see the kid, and that's entirely possible. All right. So we can distinguish between the disease and the infection. So the infection is just having the parasite, having the worm. Just because you have the worm doesn't necessarily mean you exhibit hookworm disease. Right? Many people are infected with hookworm, but they don't really exhibit any of these diseases. They don't exhibit really the loss of appetite or the geophagy or anything else. All right, so whether or not you exhibit this disease kind of comes down to what species of hookworm you have, how many hookworms you have inside your gut, and your nutritional status. All right, so with the number of worms, hopefully it's self-explanatory to say the more worms you have, the more likely you are to exhibit these symptoms. All right, so more is bad. Species of hookworm can play a role. So in order to produce the same amount of pathology, would take 100 ancylostima or anywhere from 500 to 1,000 Nicator. That's a pretty drastic difference. Now, why that difference? What do you think? Yeah, Nicator didn't consume as much blood. It only consumed that 0.03 mils per worm per day versus 0.26 mils per worm per day. So you can see that, yeah, man, you need 5 times or more worms in order to produce the same type of symptoms. So this kind of leads to the whole blood loss thing. And blood loss is really driving a lot of this pathology. Then the other thing is that nutritional condition of the host. So typically, if I have 50 hookworms, I'm probably not going to exhibit the same type of symptoms or pathology as someone who is starving and has 1 meal a week. Right? Say, you've probably seen Survivor, right? So Survivor at day, what, 41? 39 days? How long does it last? 39 days? The game? 31? About? Jeez.
I've watched Survivor like a long time.
Yeah, I think it's like 40 days or so. So at the end of that 40 days, their nutritional status is much worse. Right? They don't get the same type of food, they don't get the same type of nutrients. Those individuals are going to be more likely to exhibit the severe symptoms. That's all plays in. All right. The other thing that kind of I didn't put it here, but that is rather interesting, is this worm is one of those worms that seems to affect races differently. So Caucasians are about 10 times more susceptible to the infection and disease than African Americans. So if you kind of go back and look at the South, it's the 1800s, southern plantation development in like Mississippi, Alabama, all right. And the way arts have portrayed the differences, different groups, minus like your whole South Carolina, southern plantation environments, but just in everyday life, you would end up seeing white individuals being portrayed mostly as being lazy, not working, and then in the background, maybe even focal point, depending on the artist that's doing it, you would see African Americans as always working fields, we're doing everything. And Mark Twain actually suggested that perhaps that difference in portrayal, being accurate, isn't necessarily a consequence of Caucasians being lazy, but actually due to hookworm infection. Because if you say Caucasians are 10 times more susceptible, well, the flip side is African Americans are 10% as likely to actually get it and acquire the infection. So this is one of these diseases where it seems like race does have a difference, does play a role in whether or not you can get the infection, and then if you do have the infection, whether or not you exhibit some of these symptoms. We'll talk about that effect again later on in the course.
Do we know why?
Do we know why? Not offhand. Not for this one. Not for this parasite. Could be a consequence of our evolutionary history. As we'll hear about some other parasites. The African blacks have resistance to parasites that are endemic to Africa. And Caucasians don't, are like highly susceptible to some of those. So we'll talk about malaria and its role, trypanosomes, and so forth. So we'll kind of, again, you gotta think big picture, long-term evolutionary history here. You're in a constant evolutionary arms race, at least for our society until what, 1500s maybe, the age of exploration. All right, we've been kind of isolated. Now, that's all going to go out once we started migrating and moving. It's all different. So we'll talk about it. All right, last part of this hookworm, canine hookworm, Ancylosoma canine. We present this here because we can't get infected with the adults, but we can get nailed by those J3s, and that produces some significant pathology. That kid that was in Florida, buried in the sand and picked it up, he probably had something like this. All right, at least the descriptions that they said. So the causes of this creeping eruptions, as they call it, or cutaneous larval migrans, is due to penetration of the J3s into the skin. All right. And then migration. All right. Migration under the skin. Now, in a dog host, all right, dog can get infected with this parasite, penetration through the skin, it can penetrate through the oral mucosa, and as I said with the life cycle, when dealing with the dog hookworms, if they swallow that J3, the J3 could remain in the gut and develop to the J4 in the adults. But if it hits us, what's going to happen is that this worm starts to migrate, but it can't get through the epidermis. It can't get to the blood vessels or the lymphatic system. So it only stays in the top layer of our epidermis and wanders around completely. Now, as it's wandering around, it's causing damage. It's releasing waste products, so our immune system now is fighting it and generating this inflammatory response. The result is something like this. You get a red, itchy wound, right? Lasts somewhere from weeks to months until either the worm dies, the J3 dies, or you treat it. So here, you can actually trace where that worm went because it's leaving damage, and we have inflammatory response all along the way. Now, our immune system really isn't killing off the J3, isn't killing off the parasite. Instead, it's responding to the damage and trying to repair. That's the BuzzFeed article on that student, or on that kid, and I can't remember what, 2018, I think? I have to go back and look at the link. I remember when it happened. Because people talk about, oh, is this the end of the world? Beach life? Is this the end of beach life as we know it? So many things you don't know. Coming from the people that like raw fish. Come on. Anyways, this is probably what he had. And that's this dog hookworm, non-human hookworm, gets into the skin and it can't find its way. It can't penetrate through into the dermis layer. This parasite is readily treated with drugs, with topical drugs. So you can apply the topical anti-parasitic drugs. Albendazole, maybe? But yeah, it'll clear it up. So it's not very deep. So that the topical treatment will just absorb in the top layers, kill off the worm, your host immune system then goes and clears it out. Actually ran into somebody here that had it. Shortly after I started here, I was out in Menard collecting at that creek. I ran into the mayor of Menard, whose father had it. Got it treated. They were out, the river had flooded, so they were out wading in their rubber boots, and they had, water went up over into the boots, mud them up. That's probably how he got it infected. It was up his legs. So, can we get it here? Definitely. Any questions?
So if you treat it with the topical drugs and obviously the J3 dyes, are you still gonna have the actual, not scarring, but the itchiness and all of that?
No, it'll clear up. It'll clear up. Yeah, it clears up. Has anyone had one? This is it. If your dog gets hookworms, this is one that you could possibly have gotten. And that's typically a clue that you have it, or that your dog has hookworms, that you develop this. Walking around outside barefoot. All right. So that wraps up part 1, which was a hookworms. Pretty big. So let's move to part 2. Part 2, also GI tract residents. But now, these are the non-hookworms. So hopefully you can see hookworms is a lot, covered a lot, there's a lot of pathology, and the reason being that it's affected humans for a long time. It still affects us, And it's something that we could definitely get here in the States. So the rest of these are also GI tract residents. All but one of them we can get. All right, so we're in the family Ascaridae. These members of this family exhibit both oral transmission, they exhibit oral transmission, but they have this tissue migration. So it's kind of a question mark. Well, did the tissue migration develop first, and then it switched to where you can actually acquire it through the oral route? Or was this always an oral route, and for some reason it just undergoes this migration for some benefit? All right, and what's that benefit? Who knows? Who knows? Now, members of these worms are generally large, stout worms. You see one, this is Ascaris. I mean, you pull them out. I mean, in a live one, real one, I mean, it feels pretty robust, right? Muscular and so forth. These individuals have 3 prominent lips. We can't see any of them because we're not going to have any of those live specimens. Although some of our larval stages that are available have these lips that we could see if we kind of tip them up on the end and look at. Now these worms lack a pharyngeal or esophageal bulb, so they lack that kind of the narrowing and then that really robust bulb. But some of our members may have a ventriculus, which kind of looks like it's a bulb shape, but it's not super muscular. Right? Not like our hookworm esophagus. Right? And these members could also have either digestive or absorptive teeth. So in those, we're talking instead of having your esophagus and then your bulb ventriculus and then the esophagus, at that esophagus, you may have a branch, a cecum, that either runs posteriorly or runs anterior. You could have 2 that go forward, 2 that go back, or you could have 1 that goes forward and 1 that goes back. All right, there's variation of those. Next also, some of our larval stages, you can see the cecum. The example for us is Ascaris. We're going to talk about Ascaris. This is an old parasite, or at least I should say, we've known about this parasite at least back to the ancient Egyptians, because this was a parasite that was mentioned in the Ebers Papyrus. Greek philosophers talked about this. There's 2 species of Ascaris. Ascaris sum infects pigs. Ascaris lumbricoides infects humans. Their distinction has always been very controversial because looking at them, you can't tell the difference. Can't tell the difference. A lot of people would say that they're both the same species, but genetically they seem to be different. And Ascaris, the ones that are going into pigs, they don't seem to go into humans and vice versa. So how do we know that they're different? Well, if you look at them on a plate, you can't tell. What you actually have to do is use SEM and look at the very anterior end of the worm on the inner edge of their lips, of the 3 prominent lips. There are tiny denticles on what are called dentigerous ridges that is found along that inner lip, and that is the difference, the number of those things. Just crazy, if you ask me. Absolutely crazy. All right, did you guys get this? We're gonna go to the life cycle. All right, life cycle. This life cycle, I'm going to use Ascaris lumbricoides. All right, Ascaris, same life cycle. It's just going into pigs. All right. Enlarge this. So our worm we'll see wrong there. Ascaris lumbricoides. We're going to start with our adult. The adult lives in the small intestine. And as you'll learn, it's not necessarily confined to the small intestine. It can travel. But we're going to say its final site. You know, if you get 1 or 2 or 3, that's it. If you get 10, you're going to be finding it in the small intestine. If you get 10, you'll find it in the small intestine. All right? Eggs are going to drop out, or the female worm's going to drop our eggs. Eggs are going to find their way out of the host by way of the feces. Okay. And inside these eggs, we will have the J1s that molt to our J2 stage. And then we've got this question mark. This is a point of contention. And that's why I put it dashed line. There's a dispute as to what the true infective stage is. Is it a J3 or is it a J2? All right. So some people argue this is a J3. It gets the J3 stage, and that is our infective stage. Some people would say that it is the J2 stage. All right. So in our life cycle, let's kind of do J2 or /J3. Again, there's a dispute. Now, this whole process, the eggs come out unembryoed, all right, and it takes 9 to 13 days just to get to that J1 stage. All right, but once we get to the J1 stage, then we can develop fairly rapidly to get to the J2, J3. So say it's going to take 3 weeks before we can be infected. Now, the eggs are going to remain in the environment until we consume. All right, so we are in the environment. We accidentally consume an egg. Think unwashed produce. Once we get in there, the egg hatches releasing the J2 or the J3, whichever one we're going with. All right, so that is in our small intestine. And you can say, whoa, what's with this white space? Because we're already there. Ascaris doesn't do that. Our J2, J3 is going to penetrate out of the gut. Penetrate out of the gut and get into the blood or the lymphatic system. All right, get into the blood or lymphatic system. They utilize that then to get to the heart. Again, why? Who knows? We weren't around when it evolved. But it goes to the heart, and then it gets to the lungs. From here, it's similar to hookworms. In that, our J2 or J3s burst into the lungs at the alveoli. So hopefully you notice that's going to be a cause of pathology, potential cause of pathology. All right. Now, this is where we diverge from the hookworms. We're a J2 or a J3. All right. If we're a J3, we will molt to a J4 while we're in the lungs. If we're a J2, we have to molt to a J3 and then molt again to the J4. And all of this is happening in the lungs. All right, so it's maturing and it's migrating up to the glottis where we will cough and swallow. And it gets our J4 back to the small intestine, where it can finish its maturation, molting to our adult stage. All right, and then eventually we start producing eggs at about 60 to 65 days post-infection. Couple things. How long does it take to get out in our lungs? So to go this transition, we're molting, so they stay in the lungs about 10 days. It's how long they stay in the lungs to ultimately migrate up to the glottis. And they need to do this. They need to get to that J4 because the J4 is resistant to the stomach acid. If our worm does not make it to the J4 stage by the time it gets to the glottis and we cough and swallow, that J3 is going to die. So there's definitely something going on here where this migration is conferring some sort of advantage to the worm so that it has become fixed in our population. All right, what is that? I don't know. Maybe there's something in the lungs that the worm needs to get this maturation, whereas it's not present in the small intestine. Who knows? But what we do know, that it has to get to that J4 stage before it can migrate, or before it can survive the trip through the stomach. Other thing about this, and especially when we talk about adaptations for transmission, it's the egg. These eggs come out, all right, the eggs are our transmission stage. Well, the eggs aren't exhibiting active transmission. They're not moving around, right? They can't, seek out, hosts. They can't move in different directions. So what do they have? Well, our eggs have all 4 layers. So your outer lipid layer and that uterine layer, that proteinaceous layer. All right. All 4 layers in this egg makes these eggs very resistant. Resistant to what? Resistant to desiccation, resistant to disinfections. All across the board. It's going to survive a wide range of conditions. I think I told you, those eggs that were in the Ascaris worms that you dissected in zoology, some of them were probably infected. Either wear gloves, all right, keep from getting infected. Okay. Any questions on the life cycle? All right. So this is what I have up here for images. So the eggs, it's very, very resistant. They take on this shape, this kind of rough shape. Definitely, when you see eggs like this, you know they're Ascarids. All right, they're thick. They tend to be brown. They tend to be brown because they're stained with stomach acid or with bile salts. That's typically what causes them to stain, but they usually have this brownish in color. Right? We talked about the dispute between the infective stage, is it J2 or at J3. Fortunately for us, it's an egg. It's a developed egg. An embryonated egg is our infective stage. And it's either a J2 or a J3. And we also said we have to get to the J4 stage before it goes back through the stomach. So, as you're going to see, when we think about stages that can survive the stomach, well, the egg can survive the stomach. All right, we ingest the egg and then it hatches in the small intestine. The J4 can survive the stomach. All right, it has to get to that stage in order to survive the stomach. And then our last one for this parasite is actually the adults can actually come back into the stomach. So I consider that gruesome pathology. You might not. So I think what we're going to do is stop here with the life cycle, and then on Wednesday we'll kind of finish out these worms. Hopefully finish out these worms before talking about the tissue rollers. All right. I did include some cross sections. We don't have the pharynx cross section, but it's so prominent. Remember when we talk about the symmetry, the triradiate and the hexamer symmetry? This is almost all our nematodes have this triradiate symmetry of our esophagus, the muscular esophagus. It's just we don't have any that are cross sections. Someone wants to do a project and do histology in the lab and stain some, so we get some of these interesting projects. All right. See you in the lab.